a world where authenticity is in such short supply and manufactured, and AI's out there and CGI creates this and that and whatever. When you see, how did they get that arrow to go through his neck like that?
It's just amazing what came from that movie. And it always sticks out to me because I got to see it with no expectations. I happened to be working at the mall.
What I'll do first is maybe apply it to my day job where, wealth management, taxes, trust and estates law, structuring, all of those types of things. There really isn't that much that's new under the sun.
If you're looking to get into the genre, there are so many things to appreciate beyond just, well, this is the story and this is how it progresses. It's all the different things that go into it of how did they actually accomplish this task.
Hey, you're watching Just Press Record on the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Matt Ziegler, and on each episode, I invite not one, but two guests to join me for a conversation-style interview. These are smart, funny, usually a little eccentric, frequently a little weird, often very online friends of mine, and even if you don't understand what they have in common at first, just wait, because I've seen some common ground between them that I've been dying to ask them about, and Just Press Record. The show practically named itself, seriously. So subscribe, like, comment below, and stick around at the end of the disclosures, disclaimers, and reminders, and, come find me, cultishcreative.com, at cultishcreative on Twitter, and by name on LinkedIn. Without further ado, throw your seatbelts on. Let's make it a record. Okay, I am pressing record now. You're watching Just Press Record. This is the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm your host, Matt Ziegler. Happy pre-Halloween. This is a first. This is a first for Just Press Record. And look at this. Look at it kind of not as a guest repeat. This is truly a guest continuation. CT and Frazer, they didn't know each other before we did the initial recording that we did before we pressed record. And the conversation just kept continuing. And it was so much so with this cool back and forth and the emails and the other things that I was laying witness to that I was like, I don't know. Is it a sequel? Is it a continuation? Is it part deux? Is it Just Press Record Strikes Back? CT versus Frazer in cyberspace? And I'm going to leave the crazy intro out. It's in part one. You can go back. You can listen to that. I even wore my Army of Darkness shirt for this, which is probably,
well done.
I should have kept it.
Nice work.
Part three. But yeah. So yell to my wife outside to find my Evil Dead 2 shirt. Maybe you'll see it swap out. We're talking murders. We're talking mayhem. We're talking monsters. There's a reason that you guys are here. So actually, first off, CT Reese, watch with CT on YouTube. Say hello.
How's it going? Yeah, we won't do the full intro, but yeah, if you want to see me on YouTube, watch with CT, all kinds of horror, sci-fi, weird movie reviews. About 6 months in, and as I was telling you guys before, I'm just having a really good time with it.
Rocking and rolling. Frazer Rice, Wealth Actually himself. Welcome to the show again, Frazer.
Glad to be on. Double shout out to CT's podcast. It's a lot of fun. You can find me at wealthactually.com. I have a robust stream of consciousness Twitter account, I guess. I'm sort of thinking about whether New York's getting a new mayor and all sorts of finance things. And my day job, I try to deal with tax and structure for wealthy folks and family offices and things like that at Next Capital.
So this is the perfect reason you're here to answer this question for me. And Frazer, you go first on this.
Okay.
Why do you love horror as a genre as much as you? It's pre-Halloween. Let's get some people excited about some things. Why do you love horror?
Boy, it's a broad, awesome question because part of it is nostalgia. I grew up, going to Blockbuster or even before Blockbuster to video stores and wandering the aisles, and everything from the VHS boxes, captivating attention, to then going into a lot of these different movies and seeing how problems get solved. I think is what really interested me, and the idea of being scared and accessing an emotion that, if you grew up in suburban Westchester County, New York, there's not much to be really scared of. It also ignites a lot of imagination. And I like what I would describe as kind of like a pirate flag ethos that I've learned about over time as directors and actors and producers and, people who wear thousands of hats to make these things happen. how they tell a story with no resources, a lot of ingenuity and a lot of persistence. And to me, I really groove on that, even if a movie in and of itself is bad. Sometimes there are also scenes that I pick apart and say, boy, I really like what they did there, or wonder how they did that. And so that all that combination of accessing different emotions that you normally wouldn't, seeing people in the early parts of their careers, seeing that problem solving, and then seeing little things that really sort of, it hits a synapse where I sort of say, okay, I'm really interested in how they executed that. All of that is sort of the big stew that makes it interesting for me and why I keep into the space.
What about you, CT? Same thing. Just like why horror? Why did you pick this subgenre to help you self-identify?
I don't know if you necessarily pick it, so to speak. Kind
The
of
heart wants what the heart
calls
wants,
out to you. Exactly.
and it's ripping the heart out. Come on.
Exactly. So I think my journey with horror has been very interesting because it truly was the forbidden fruit growing up. That was R-rated movies, not a thing in my house. So it wasn't until I became a teenager that I could really start branching out and exploring these things that were sort of banned for me, that I would get tastes of when I would go over to other people's houses and see the sort of things their parents let them watch. So I knew sort of what was going on, but I couldn't digest it for myself. And then as I moved on, I got the cheap thrills early on as a teenager. That's what I was looking for, especially in the early 2000s. There was so much blood and guts and gore. So that was appropriate for me at that age. But as I got older and learned more about film and how films are made and got more into independent movies, that DIY punk rocker of me turned on the intellectual side of my brain, I guess. And I started trying to look into how are these movies made? How are these people doing this? And then also, why are these movies made? Because I wanted to go and revisit these movies from the 70s and 80s. And when you look at these movies that are made in those time periods, as well as what's going on historically, you've got serial killers emerging in the 70s. Well, all of a sudden the slasher becomes a thing in the late 70s into the 80s. And the 80s, we've got all sorts of wild movies funded by just capitalism kind of going wild, right? Everybody was trying to make a buck in the 80s, and we found out that horror could be a way to do that. So you got a lot of artists that took advantage of that sort of free money, along with just a lot of pure schlock that, maybe has some value. As Frazer said, sometimes it just takes one scene to make a movie a classic. But then even, moving on from that, a movie like Host that came out on Shudder a few years ago, that wouldn't have been made if we weren't all hunkered down in COVID. So it always speaks to its time. So I think that's why I like horror, is that it speaks to both sides for me. Like the intellectual that wants to pick things apart, but then also the part of me that just wants to go on a roller coaster and get scared.
Frazer, that part speaks to its time. I'm not putting you on the expert historian block. You really think about this a lot, so I think it's safe for me to ask. Talk me through time and how it's evolved a little bit in this industry and the way these stories are told.
Well, I mean, so the horror is not something that's particularly new. I mean, you go back to what could be very scary stories even back in the Bible and before that, and you start, meandering up through Dracula and Frankenstein, and up through to other different types of monsters. And, there's some deep-seated need to educate / entertain / scare that I think transcends sort of different eras and epochs and things like that. If we start going up to, let's say, film and where that goes, that's a real evolution, because I think you went from the written word and to maybe radio, which is one way to sort of tell a story, and the campfire story that everyone sort of thinks about. I'm sure that goes back to time as well. But film in this case, if we start really getting into the 20s and 30s with Nosferatu, which is usually the first one that most people have heard about, which is got the very famous vampire scene. And it's just one of those deals where I think as the business model changes throughout time, as the story component changes throughout time, and as the different film techniques change throughout time. The acting base, I think, is always there. I think the stories are always kind of there, but then the different tools that you have at your disposal really give you a chance to flex your muscles differently. And for those people who are trying to break into the movie business, maybe not from a pure horror angle, but just trying to break into it, the horror genre really is the way to get in many ways. You see all these different directors and actors who, started out way back when, whether it's Steve McQueen in The Blob or Jack Nicholson, et cetera. They get their chance to, maybe break out of an ensemble cast and, be the driver of the boat actor wise in a film. And that's what's interesting too. When I go back and look at some of these things and say, way back when, what did they look like? The time element, I think, is interesting because that business model part really kicks in. That pirate flag aspect really kicks in because it's, oftentimes a lot of fun, with your friends with a Super 8 camera out doing something to, just, fool around and try to do all that type of that thing. And and it's fun. And ultimately that part's timeless. The tools change as you go forward, and that's where you go from there.
CT, this aspect of it too, the whole, like the gateway introduction thing, whether it's an actor or probably even a director or whatever else. How do you think about it as this attractor of ambition?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a filter, isn't it? We always think of the successes. We think of the Sam Raimis, but we forget about all the directors that directed like 2 or 3 horror movies, and that's all anyone was ever going to fund them for because they were never able to put it together, so to speak. So, horror does allow that foot in the door. And that's just because it's so broad. I mean, when we say horror, you really could mean anything from a pure creature feature to you've got body horror. You can go pure psychological horror. It's such a broad genre, but I think when you put the horror label on it, it allows you to have low budget. It could be more rough around the edges. I think people are a bit more forgiving because they can see that the spirit of the whole thing is good. And that sort of allows some of that cream to rise to the top, so to speak, versus, all the trash in horror's wake.
Do you have any good stories about either anybody who comes to mind as like people who got in because of it? I know Frazer already mentioned a couple of big names, the Steve McQueens and some of the others. Anybody else who's got humble beginnings that you'd want to shout out?
I mean, Matt McConaughey, Renee Zellweger. I mean, they were Jennifer Aniston. I mean, they were all in Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequels, and so that's just one thing. You go into a lot of other Oscar winner types who started out in the space. Who was in Nightmare on Elm Street 3?
Arquette?
Yeah, she won an Oscar. That was one of her first starring roles. And it can be a bridge, a TV bridge for people who are in TV shows, and then it really is that chance if you're an actor to go from maybe that CSI ensemble cast to getting in somewhere where for $50,000 and 4 weeks out of your summer, you get to helm something. And if you happen to catch magic in a bottle, it can, A, you might be attached to something that makes money, but then B, someone at a casting director or something like that looks at that and says, hey, you know what, there's something there. They can carry a movie, whatever that means. And that of course has different intonations, or they have talent beyond just having, a great way to scream or, an evil look or something like that. But those things all exist, and the world's littered with all those things. And it's fun to kind of go back and, if you go into IMDb and sort of look at your favorite actor and see where they, their real early roles, what kind of direct they were a part of. You can sort of see if you can detect any talent back then that they were able to mine going forward as they, went on to their, Victorian Oscar-winning period piece.
Yeah, true. This is great. It kind of makes me think of it as like there's a minor league baseball farm team type thing.
Right.
Yeah. If you think about it that way, But that's really
Yeah.
cool because if you don't have the support system for that, like the majors can't follow without all the other stuff.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, the one that sticks out to me probably because of this year, Shaun of the Dead. I mean, think about all the careers that movie launched. I mean, those guys, they were on TV over in the UK, but there's a lot of people on TV over in the UK that we never hear about on this side of the pond. But I mean, that Edgar Wright's a pretty major name in directing right now. I mean, Nick Frost has a movie coming out. It's just amazing what came from that movie. And it always sticks out to me because I got to see it with no expectations. I happened to be working at the mall and someone was coming through with tickets for a screener. Hey, do you want to go see this horror romantic comedy zombie movie? And me and my manager were like, that sounds dumb as hell. Sure, let's go check it out. And we ended up seeing like an absolute classic of, like, you walked out and you're like, that was unbelievable. Like, that was one of the best movies I've ever seen. And it was a pivotal moment for me in just getting into horror because it made me want to get more into those zombie movies. I went back and I rewatched Night of the Living Dead. I rewatched Dawn of the Dead after I watched Shaun of the Dead because I knew I missed jokes and I wanted to appreciate it more because it was that good of a movie. And what a proving ground for those guys. I mean, again, it launched a number of careers.
There's a billion examples of this, but let's talk a little bit about that. This recycling of ideas, both directly or indirectly. We'll let you take this anywhere you want to take this, Frazer.
I can take it in two big directions that I think of. And what I'll do first is maybe apply it to my day job where, wealth management, taxes, trust and estates law, structuring, all of those types of things. There really isn't that much that's new under the sun. And, when you're going out and either marketing or you're trying to tell a story to get a client to understand something that they should understand and deal with, or otherwise address an issue or take action or feel something, or to let them know that there are issues around the corner, you've got ultimately a lot of different tricks up your sleeve that you have to think about. And in the horror world, those are tropes, which are things that the fan base has come to rely on through their deep experience with the genre. And some of them that exist out there, the final girl, the twist at the end, don't go upstairs, the call's coming from inside the house, those types of things. If you go into wealth management marketing, those things all exist. And then there will be advancements or things that move forward a little bit. In wealth management, there's a big sort of behavioral finance, estate planning, tax planning, all of these things that suddenly seem very novel. They're not new in any way, shape, or form. But then if you apply it to what's going on in horror, it'll be something like found footage or vampires, or this year it's werewolves, or maybe it's period pieces or something like that. And all of these things, everything, there isn't a lot that's new under the sun, but there are definitely different ways to think about how that works. And the part that I find interesting about the horror genre, and not that I sort of spend all day, every day trying to apply it to my day job, but sometimes it intersects, is to say, how can I tell a story where the technical, which you can find anywhere, is applied to the audience in a way that they understand, they feel, they get the problem and why it needs to be solved. And I think that's what a lot of horror directors and talent try to do, is they have a set of tools, whether they're adroit with them or not, but they come equipped with some sensibilities, they come equipped with some stories, they come equipped with some ways of doing things. And they know at the other end of the table, the eyeballs across, that are watching what they're doing, that they have to cause an emotion to happen or they fail. And in a sense, it applies almost everywhere. It could be law, it could be wealth management, it could be accounting even, or, any sort of advice component where you have to have a real relationship with somebody. If you don't connect, it's over and it doesn't work. And that technical expertise never quite gets through. And I think the horror genre is an interesting way to sort of see that in action and to try to figure out how to relate to an audience and cause them to feel, take action, enjoy, and move forward.
It's kind of amazing to think of it through the lens of genre prioritizing what the audience is supposed to feel. And horror is kind of one of those genres that puts that created feeling so high on the list, like almost higher than like a romance thing or something else, where like you're still going to have all sorts of different feelings about whatever the couple is or whatever the thing in front of you is. But horror really cuts to that audience feeling aspect of it. What about you, CT? Just tropes as genre expectations and everything underneath. How do you think about that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's a learned language. It's part of that horror journey I was talking about before. Like when you start, a lot of things are going to shock you. So this is a perfect example. I saw this movie Tarot earlier this year. It's not well reviewed. I thought it was pretty mediocre, but it's also a movie that as I was watching, I was like, man, if I was like 10, 11, maybe 12 years old and I saw this movie, I would think this is great. Like this is legitimately pretty scary if you're that age. So when you move on from that, the reason that it got kind of panned is because it was too tropey. It spoke the language too plainly rather than trying to play with it. It just told the story that had already been told too many times without giving us that twist or that new flavor that we need, because at the end of the day, that's really what it's all about. It's about taking this thing, we know this language, we know this story, we know it's supposed to happen here. So how am I going to tell it differently in a new and satisfying way? And that's why it's challenging, because it's very difficult to do that successfully, especially for a broad audience. And I think that's why we sometimes lean on the franchises and the IPs as well, though, because tropes are sort of it's insider jargon, right? That's for horror people, versus when you bring in a franchise or an IP, it's got more built-in expectations that I think, especially more mainstream audience can bite onto. They know what they're going to get into. They know who the killer is going to be, or they know what the vibes of that movie are going to be without needing to have seen 30 different movies of the genre and pick apart all the tropes and know, which direction it's going. You get the franchise up front. All right, I know where this is going. It's a nice little shortcut.
Just to add on to that quickly, if you heard what CT just said and eliminated the horror aspect and just dropped in the wealth management aspect with that, it would be, I think you'd sit there going, this is exactly what marketing departments are doing at the wealth management space. And, how do I resonate with the client / audience, and, what's new, that's interesting, that's important for them. And, and CT, I bet, agrees with me on this, is that, there's a cycle to these things where the novelty will wear off quickly, and the genre / industry evolves or dies. You've got to try different things and do all sorts of things. And sometimes the choices you make in trying to evolve don't work. And so those are the spectacular failures that you got to see out there. And there's an elegance and a dignity to those too. When people take big swings and they don't work, and if you're have that inside baseball part of it, you sort of say, I know what they were trying to do here, and it just didn't happen. And sometimes I look at that and go, I like that.
Give me, Frazer, stick with me on this one. And yep. I'm giving you dealer's choice on this.
Okay.
Like, take me back, whether it's Friday the 13th or Halloween. I want to talk about just like a first movie and something that later became an iconic franchise. And I want to talk about just kind of the difference between like 1 and then 2.
Oh,
because
gosh.
that first turn is so friggin' interesting.
So I will, let's see if I can do this succinctly. But so Friday the 13th, sort of the first major horror movie that I remember that were sort of concurrently were Halloween 2 and Friday the 13th Part 3. Halloween 2, which is still hot take, I'd put it right there with Halloween 1 in many ways. It's slightly different, but I love it. And Friday the 13th Part 3, for whatever reason, I've gone back and seen it dozens of times, and it's not the best of the franchise. I try to make it that way, but it isn't. But what it did was it sort of created, lit a match where I went back and discovered very early in the franchise, before they start wandering off into different, if you look at the Halloween roadmap of where there's no continuity between 1 and 10. It goes, 1 and 2, then 3 doesn't even have Michael Myers in it. And then 4 and 5 kind of go back, and 6, that wanders off too. And then 7 and 8 are, different director. And then the next 3 are a different director, and they eliminate 2. And, you need a chart. And so, for the people who access that kind of franchise late, and they tried to decipher how best to go about it, it's like the Star Wars movies. I had the magic of seeing Star Wars in 1977 when I was 4 or 5 or whenever I saw it, and took that journey through the original 3, and it without the internet and be able to enjoy the surprise of all that, and just to be completely captivated at that age, which by that point, I guess, got me to around 10 or 12 or whatever it turned out to be. On that horror component, that Halloween component, I saw the 2, in my opinion, apex predators of this series at the right time, and it just ignited the imagination on that front, such that when I sort of went through, I had, let's call it, an informed taste and an opinion as to where the genre, or that particular IP, should go, and say, it didn't work, or it did work, or I like this, or I don't like that. And then you have revisionist history where you go back and say, maybe, so let's say Halloween 3, which didn't have Michael Myers, there was a period of time where that movie, that was about as hated as it could be. And now revisionist history has been really kind to it. And I think for good reasons. I think it's got a lot of things that recommend it really. And so, you're allowed to kind of have that initial experience, then go back and have different experiences, even with the same material. And then, when you sort of are chin stroking and thinking about it a little bit, like I sometimes do, and it especially, let's say, for the Halloween, the last 3 with David Gordon Green and the choices he made, there's some that I really like, there's some that I don't, and then there are parts of each of those movies that I really like, and there are parts that I don't, and there are choices that I would have made differently, and so on. And you're allowed to do that, and that's where in that milieu, I think you can be a really active audience member, superimpose your opinion on it, and derive a lot of enjoyment, even if the source material on its own doesn't necessarily warrant it.
What about you, CT? And I'm really curious just in the way the sort of genres and tropes start to take shape inside of an IP over time. So just 1 and 2, and then you can take it as far forward from there, but planting that seed.
Yeah. So I've recently watched a number of these movies. I haven't gotten to watch all the way through the new Halloween trilogy, but speaking to that and expectations and things of that nature. So when I first saw the Halloween reboot when it came out, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a fun ride. I didn't really have any complaints at all. I hadn't watched the original Halloween in quite a while beforehand. Now, more recently, I dove deep on Halloween. I kind of fell in love with it all over again because I hadn't really watched it that intensely in quite a while. And I really fell in love with that version of Michael Myers. So yeah, I'm going to watch the reboot, the new Halloween. It's a continuation of the first one. And then they go to see Michael Myers in the first scene. I'm like, this is nonsense because he's huge. He went from being 5'10", like the same size as Bob. You get that really iconic shot where he stabs him right into the wall, but they're face to face. I mean, they're eye to eye, and Bob's a very average size guy. So this is not the Michael Myers in the first one. This is the Michael Myers from the Thorn trilogy. So they just wanted to cut out the sister aspect, but they wanted to keep that Michael Myers. And it bothered me as the movie went on because he had all these brutal kills that I loved the first time. But this time watching it, I'm like, too fast. Michael Myers wouldn't do it that way. Because having watched the initial one, you literally have to watch him choke out Annie for the better half of a minute. It's very slow. It's very intent that you have to sit there and watch it. This one, he's snapping necks. He's throwing knives through the back of people's necks. But who is this guy? he's doing this. He wasn't doing that at 21. People are usually a little wilder at 21 than in their 60s. So I know that's kind of it's a stupid reason to not like it, but because I kind of forgotten what had happened in the movie, and I went in with these marketing expectations, which was that's always the mistake, right? Going in with the marketing expectations, and it retroactively, I don't want to say it made the movie less enjoyable. I'll just say it that way. Versus Alien Romulus, which I know I'm talking about a movie that's, if you haven't seen it in theaters, there's not a way to see it right yet. Well, by the time this comes out, maybe actually, because it's coming out in October, I think, VOD. That one, it made everything before it better almost, especially Prometheus and Alien Covenant, which they never really felt like they belonged with those initial Alien films. Romulus, Fede Alvarez was able to tell his own story, but he was also able to bring the whole universe together kind of under this evil Weyland-Yutani umbrella. And going all the way back to Tropes, for me, that's when an alien movie works best. I want the creature, yeah, but I need evil Weyland-Yutani putting their finger on the scale. So like Alien Covenant, which was more of a David story, doesn't work as well for me. I want that. I want the evil company as the true antagonist, sort of using the alien, so to speak. So, yeah, that's where I'm at on those.
What's it do to the businesses of these things? And Frazer, I know you think about this too, like just like the business of the Halloween franchise is one of those. That's a horror show in and of itself. Do you want to just talk about this? Because like the franchises in some cases are harder to kill than the unkillable monsters.
So invariably, and Friday the 13th has the same problem that, say, Halloween does, which is it's family owned. You had Sean Cunningham with Friday the 13th. Then you have other people who financed it and other interlopers. You have the Akkad family who did that with Halloween. And there's sort of the intersection with other talent like John Carpenter. So we have a lot of people who have a lot of strong opinions and financially backed opinions as to how these things work. And what I think what ends up happening is you go on this, fun treasure hunt and no one has any expectations. And all of a sudden you've got a pot of gold and you've changed. Everyone's changed and their lives have changed. Their situations have changed. And then it's sort of like, okay, do we keep this going for financial reasons? You've got a studio who's knocking on the door going, awesome. Thank you. We helped support you with this. Let's turn this around and, we got to make our numbers next quarter type of thing. And you really, how do you stay true to what you think the vision's going to be? And how do you do it in a way that, the aircraft carrier that you're trying to steer in terms of a movie production keeps going in the right direction? And then you have the audience who, all of a sudden, they enjoyed the first one or the first couple for reasons. And then you've got this artistic component where you're trying to do something new. Making a movie takes a long time. It's a huge headache. It's a lot of energy. It's a lot of work. You got to raise money and you want to do something you believe in. And so if you're a director or a writer or something like that, you want to do something different. You don't necessarily want to do the same thing over and over and over again. And so that, taking that swing, you bump into the committee of the financiers and the studio and so on. And that's where a lot of times people, the IP component of what's going on and how it's developed runs up on the rocks with the audience. And, either they do something that's safe or they do something that, maybe one of the actors becomes too expensive. And then all of a sudden you've got to replace Jamie Lee Curtis for some reason. And you've lost the plot with the audience if a big reason why they're there is because that's somebody that they really enjoyed sharing that story with is no longer. And then all of a sudden, that's the complication. That's where the business aspect enters into it too. And when you really start sort of hearing about the byplay, the backstory of it, you're going, oh, well, of course he had a problem. John Carpenter wanted to do something different in Halloween 2. That didn't quite work out. Then Halloween 3 happens. He doesn't want anything to do with it. And the Akkads wanted sort of different Halloween stories, not Michael Myers, and so that each one was a little bit different. And meanwhile, the fan base is like, look, we're not putting up with this unless we get what we want here. So watching all that and sort of seeing all the backstory and how it plays out, and the different sort of whirlpools and eddies and tributaries that go into actually the miracle of making one of these things actually happen, even if you've already got an established IP, I find that very interesting. And so when it informs maybe big swings that are taken, and so I'll go back to the last 3 Halloweens where David Gordon Green didn't include the original Halloween 2 as part of the continuum, and he took it in a different direction. And then the last movie, he takes a gigantic swing as far as what he does with Michael Myers by introducing kind of a new one and so on. I loved all that in the sense that I didn't necessarily like the way it was executed, but I admired the courage and I admired the ingenuity and the different influences that he pulled into it. And for that, it may not have a lot of value, may not end up being a horror classic, but I got a lot of enjoyment sort of thinking about it and seeing where it came from and how it ended up.
Yeah, I think it's interesting from the perspective that he decided to take that swing. When you look at what happened with Friday the 13th, when I like Friday the 13th Part 5, it's so grimy, but it wasn't well received. People didn't like Roy. They wanted the real Jason. They didn't care if it was the mask. They wanted the actual Jason. I think that's why Scream is able to keep going, though. They did this 2 killer thing. So Ghostface was never one person. Ghostface could be anybody. I think that's why that franchise has had continued success without people complaining too much about the recent entries. I haven't watched 4 and 5 in a while. I remember those were kind of rough, but the more recent ones have been pretty well received. Now, again, talking about how the business affects the franchise, though, they've lost all of their stars from the new Scream movies. So now they're trying to go back to the old ones. So, again, we'll see how that works out. But at least from the perspective of having an antagonist that can be literally anyone, someone that's already involved with the franchise, it could be someone brand new. They have that mystery aspect going for them that the other slasher movies don't have. And they're kind of boxed in because of that. We all want to see, as I was just complaining about, the version of Michael Myers that I want to see, or the version of Jason that I want to see. And when you've got a dozen Friday the 13th movies, there's a lot of different versions of Jason out there, and they're not all even necessarily Jason. So it really, it just makes it very interesting, again, from the business and the artistic perspective, to try to keep some of these franchises together. And especially, when you have the director at the helm who has no interest after making a big hit. I don't want to come back to that. Like, yeah, sure, John Carpenter, I'll write the second one, fine, but I'm not directing it. I want to do my own thing. So yeah, it is interesting how that all works out. And it does allow, I was talking about Fede Alvarez before. The reason we're still talking about him is probably because he was so successful with the Evil Dead reboot. And I think that was successful because he didn't try to tie it too closely to those original ones, because how are you going to do that? Even Evil Dead 1 and 2 are so different, yet so accepted by the fan base. It decided to just completely forgo the slapstick and sort of, it takes place in its own universe. I don't know. There's some absolute nods to the original Evil Dead, but I think that was the way to go with that franchise. And again, you're not as boxed in because you don't have that, that single antagonist. You've got a Deadite character that you can play a little bit with.
This idea of, and I'm sure we could just go online and Google this, but what fun would that be? That's not the truth of our entire conversation here. I'm curious about like best franchises for money. Like, give me some ideas of who the most successful business ventures have been. But then I want to counterbalance that of the best ones just for pure, I don't know if I want to call it fan service, but just maybe critical fan service. Like, who are you like, they don't let me down, or they've minimally let me down? So give me the business side, but then give me the fan side for each of you, some of your tops.
I mean, I guess I'll start with the business just to get that going. I mean, I think that uh, like the Halloweens all pretty dependably made money. They wandered off and sort of really tested the fan bases as far as their patience with the different components of the different swings they took on it. But they made money. The Friday the 13th all made money. The Nightmare on Elm Street, I think they generally made money until about 5, and then they didn't take many chances with that, and they got very cartoonish, and they really alienated their fan base. And then they haven't quite recovered from that in that sense. I think on the business side too, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacres, I think they pretty dependably made money, and that goes to the durability of the fan base in many ways. And I mean, the horror genre, and again, CT pointed this out, it's very fractionalized. There'll be, people like their zombies and others who like their slashers and all that stuff. But as a general matter, they'll give something a chance. And so if you've got something that has some quality to it, and it doesn't cost as, you're not making a Marvel movie for, $500 million and then another $250 for marketing. You can do it a lot more inexpensively than that. You have a really good chance of making, that good 3x, 5x that you need to in order to, get money back to people and all that stuff. And that's why people go back to the IP that worked before, because you're going to have a fan base that's pretty amazing on that front, that's willing to give it a chance and get you that opening weekend that you want, and maybe, hopefully downloads later and stuff like that. I'm trying to think, what are the other, I know the Omen came out, the Aliens, I think generally make money, although certainly the Covenant world and so on, they started getting very production oriented, and that I would imagine they probably hit a pothole there once or twice. And Alien 3 didn't work, I don't think, money wise. That was expensive, and David Fincher, who's an amazing director, and I mean Alien 3, which is one of those underrated movies. If you go back and look at it, especially the look and feel, maybe he did a great job with that. But and if you get it wrong once, boy, it takes a long time to get the credibility back, and to maybe get some of that institutional memory from the purse string deciders to give you another go.
Yeah,
What about you, CT?
David Gordon Green, he put out the Halloween trilogy. You got One Chance at an Exorcist, and he screwed that one up. Apparently, I haven't seen it, but man, it got
it's so badly reviewed that I feel like I am really making a bet with an hour and a half to even try it, which is sad too. I mean, there and I'll let you get back to T on your thing, but I have to take really great pains not to over trailer myself and ruin things with either trailers or reviews and things like that. Maxine, which is an example of a trilogy, which I liked all three for in many ways different reasons. I mean, I had to basically hide under the covers to make sure I didn't ruin the third one, because I was really looking forward to it. I knew it was going to be amazing, or at least amazing for me. And it's hard to do now. Not as hard way back when I was growing up with this stuff. The thing would show up in the movie. You'd see this amazing, either VHS box or a poster, and you enjoyed it, or you got Fangoria magazine or something like that. Far different experience now, when these things can get downloaded, and the reviews come out 20 minutes before the movie comes out. You're like, where, how'd that happen?
Yeah, that's been interesting with there's a lot of festival reviews coming out recently, and I'm like, man, I want to watch these reviews, but I don't want to watch this review because I don't want to know. And actually, Witchboard is a reboot that I'm actually looking forward to. Now, Witchboard is a 1986, it's one of those crappy little independent horror movies, but it was fun. It's a fun, casual, throw it on a Friday night or a Saturday night with your friends and have a good time with it. And it's being remade by the same guy that did the 1988 Blob. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing, in the 80s, he took a movie that was 30 years old, he redid it his own way, and it was better. So I'm hoping that he can sort of do the same thing here almost 40 years later from the original Witchboard. But that's not a franchise that made any money. That was the initial question. But man, I would assume it's probably got to be Friday the 13th, just because they were so cheap to make and they so consistently made money. In my head, I want to say, is it Terminator? Just because Terminator 2 made so much money, but that might have been so long ago that are you adjusting for interest here, or like for time
It's
period?
the inflation adjusted.
Yeah, inflation.
You didn't
I don't
prepare
know
these numbers, guys.
how are we doing this? But bottom line is, if you've got 10 movies plus in your franchise, it's a pretty safe bet that it makes money. And really, the only reason we're not seeing Friday the 13th and Halloween's cranked out, especially Friday the 13th, is a lot of usually business issues.
Litigation. They're fighting with each other over who controls it. That's
and
that's unfortunate.
It sounds like they got that figured out, though, because they're making the show.
Yeah, I you know what, I followed that tangentially, and somebody was okay with it, so I guess they're pushing it forward. I'm very interested, CT, in your opinion on the franchises that deliver. And I will say one franchise that I don't even really think of it as a franchise, but one that's delivered, I think, pretty consistently that no one really talks about in this way is the Psycho franchise. Now, number one is incredible. Psycho 2, in my opinion, is one of the most underrated sequels, period. And then 3, and then the TV series and all that went consistently good. To the point where I would almost say that that's worked out better than some of the other traditional ones.
Yeah, that's tough too, because the original was so difficult. Actually, it's really funny. And it's almost embarrassing to admit this, but I'm a product of my time. I didn't see the original Psycho first. I saw the Vince Vaughn Psycho in theaters. That was my first Psycho. And I was like, it's pretty good. Then you go and you watch the original, you're like, oh, that's why everyone hates this. Okay, I understand.
Right.
Understand that. I think it was like Gus Van Sant made that one too. But
yeah.
So yeah, the Psycho franchise is fantastic. Actually, almost surprisingly good. I got like a box set. It has like the 4 Psycho movies on it cheap. Just thinking, well, I want the first one. It'd be nice to have the other ones. And going back and rewatching them, I was like, wow, yeah, they were really good movies. It wasn't just my 22-year-old bad taste. They actually held up, because there's plenty of movies in that time period that I'd be embarrassed to say I ever liked. So I'm glad I was glad to see that those held up. But man, as far as a consistent, well, you know what? I'm going to say just consistent for me. Oh, shoot, but those last 2. I wanted to say the Of the Dead series. I love Night of the Living Dead. I love the original Dawn of the Dead. I like Day of the Dead. I like the Dawn of the Dead reboot. I love the way that the 2 Dawn of the Dead movies kind of bookend the mall era of America, whereas the first one's kind of like the beginnings of the mall. And then the last one came out, and really within 10 years, malls are dead.
Right.
So you can't make another one, right? Like, you can't make another Dawn of the Dead because you can't do it in a mall, because nobody goes to the mall. Some of those later Romero movies were bad, but I did like Land of the Dead. After that, it gets... we don't need to talk about it so much, but really up until Land of the Dead, it's a great franchise.
What about ecosystems around these things? You've both thrown out the VHS copies and walking through the aisles in the video store, the posters at the movie theater, even some of these, the modern era too. Like, how do you think about, because this is another really cool thing this creates, besides the attractor and filter for people into the business, there's like just these amazing cottage industries that maybe aren't amazing businesses, but like these cottage industries are so cool. What are some of your favorites, Frazer?
Well, so I know we talked a little bit about VH boxes before, but I actually went back and looked at a couple and one omission that I'm still kicking myself, so I'm going to fix it here, which was Happy Birthday to Me, which the VHX box has a guy getting a skewer through his throat. And, for some reason, I remember that better than anything. And I'm like, man, and then you watch the movie and that's fine. And the woman from Little House on the Prairie's on it. And it's funny, that part, but it has sort of traditional early 80s schlock attached to it. There are times when these things can turn into art. And I say art with, sort of highfalutin, quotation marks around it. Two examples, one of which is a movie poster that got banned pretty quickly, which was the Friday the 13th with Jason Goes to Manhattan, which had the I Love New York symbol on it. And instead of the heart, it had Jason's mask and then a knife thing going through the poster itself. And I was like, man, that is clever. Makes me want to watch the movie. Everything about it, I was like, man, this really works. Well, New York State took a different approach to it, said, no, we don't want that happening one bit. There's another one where for the movie The Descent, where there's it's really it's sort of tricky to describe it, but it's a glowing component where it's got a skull motif, but it's made up of bodies, and it directly references a Salvador Dali movie, or excuse me, painting. And it doesn't really tell you what's going on in the movie strictly from the poster, but I looked at that and I said, whoever came up with that, boy, is that smart. And it was visually really cool. And it's things like that where I'm like, there are people operating at these things, trying to get your attention in a sea of information, even way back when, where you're trying to, figure that stuff out, and you didn't have the internet and so on, but you're fighting with, Terminator over here and Star Wars over here and Strawberry Shortcake over here. And all of a sudden you've got something where, if it rises to the level of art and it catches your imagination, maybe you go walk in and see it. And I just love that. And that cottage industry around it. It even goes to the voiceover guys, and the people who have the deep voices. And it's like, in a world where blah, 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 blah. And that type of thing, the people who stitch together the trailers, the trailer oftentimes can be art in and of itself, where it takes something that didn't really do much for it, and then all of a sudden you attach something. And the movie Thanksgiving with Eli Roth, that started as a trailer and turned into something bigger, and I think very worthy in and of itself. The constraints that people get put on them sometimes creates the friction, that creates the pearl. And I love watching that when somebody has something like that and they overcome it to produce something that's compelling.
What about you, CT? Favorite pieces of just the ecosystem?
Well, I don't know if I'm thinking about like just when I'm walking through in the 80s, now again, I wasn't allowed to rent a lot of these movies. So it's just like, what did I want to see? Right. And that's why I loved Shopping Mall. I mean, I always wanted to see Shopping Mall. And then when I found out it was robots lasering teenagers, how did I miss this movie my whole life? So, they get you interested, but the thing about those VHS covers was back in the 80s, it wasn't just horror doing that. It was, that was anything Roger Corman put out, right? So the sword and sandal movies, they always have these obnoxious covers, these scantily clad, muscle bound people. And I rented a lot of Nintendo games. Very rarely did the cover art match up with anything that was happening on the Nintendo screen. So it's something that horror decided to hang on to in a way, because you still have to have that good poster, right? That image that sells the whole thing. I'm trying to think of like more recently, I liked the In a Violent Nature poster just because it's so plain. It's basically how you see the guy most of the time. It's just, it's the Johnny, I think is his name. It's just him from behind. He's kind of just shadowed with looks like the sun setting behind him. And it's just, it's a very atmospheric shot. It tells you almost everything you need to know about that movie, just that one picture. So it is an art, it's not just, we're just going to, here's the star's head really big. When you actually think about it and make it a true art, it elevates the whole movie.
What about broader than movies, that like reviews, finding out how people are talking about this or revisiting the old stuff? And actually stick with me on this, CT, because you're actually doing this. You're attempting to do this, or it's like looking present, looking forward. Where where is this community? Because it's friggin' out there. I see it in the comments on your videos.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it gets me more hyped up to see maybe movies that wouldn't necessarily be on my radar, or movies that are like I was gonna wait until The Substance came on VOD, but I cannot deny the conversation that's going around this movie right now, and I haven't even looked at it yet. I've just seen like headlines, and I've seen threads of people talking about it. So this weekend I've got to go see it, even though, again, I wasn't really planning on it. I was kind of planning on making my way through my old watch list, but because that conversation is so loud, I just feel like I need to be a part of this, right? I need to get my own review out there so I can join in the conversation and have my own opinion. And I just don't think it works that way with a lot of other genres. Like you don't have people clamoring to see a drama so they can go online and talk about it like they do a horror movie or really any kind of strange genre movie, because it makes you feel like you found something neat and cool and different from everything else. Even though, as we were saying before, there's probably only about a dozen total stories that you could tell, but it's how you tell it and how you put the pieces together, and the new, sort of twists and turns you can take people on while going through that journey. And yeah, I mean, it's undeniable with the way things are now with the internet and social media and things constantly being fed to you. It's almost impossible to not get caught up in that sometimes, even if you don't want to. So that's really been my task, I think, recently, is trying to, even though I've got hype around me, go in with no expectations. Don't worry about the marketing. Don't necessarily worry about what the trailer's trying to tell me the movie is. Go and watch the movie and let the movie tell you what the movie is. And I think that's one of the most difficult things about watching movies now, is going and allowing the movie to be itself, because there are so many other opinions around, and there's the negative ones always get amplified too, right? So it's almost like people are out there trying to ruin things for you all the time, but it's impossible to avoid. I think people should avoid it if they can, because if you can avoid it, there's never been a better time to be a movie fan. I mean, there's never had so much access easily to such a large catalog of movies, and you can pretty much find anything online at this point. And like, as someone who likes the old Italian movies, back in the day, you'd never really know who was directing them. They'd always be under like pseudonames or whatever. Now you can actually know who directed these movies, and you can make your way through their catalog a lot more easily. Like, just little things like that. It makes it awesome to be a movie fan now, but at the same time, you have to, it's impossible to silence the hype, but you have to remember to allow yourself to have your own opinion on the movie, because that's the most difficult thing to do right now.
What do you think about that, Frazer? Anything you would pile on top of that statement?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with it. I mean, my greatest regret is not seeing Psycho in the movie theater when it came out. I was obviously born far too late, and I think that would have been just an otherworldly experience. As an example of a recent one, Longlegs, which is a Nick Cage movie that came out recently, it got a lot of great buzz, and I hadn't really focused on it except for, there was a couple of reviews saying, "Oh my God, it's the best thing in the last 10 years." And I was like, okay. And I did go into it and saying, okay, what do you think? And I liked it. And the awareness that sometimes the hyperbole can kind of create, is good. It's good for the business in some ways, because it gets people to give it a shot and so on. I liked the movie. I was glad I saw it. Was it the best movie in the genre in the last 10 years? And I don't know about that, but it was worth it. And, it really sort of being disciplined around your attention and your concentration around these things is important, because, the surprise or the twist or the jump cut or something like that the director and the writer and the actors work really hard to create. If you go in there already kind of knowing it's really unfortunate, because it's the impact is fractionalized pretty quickly.
I want to take us back through some notes. I'm going to invite you to interject. You know how this works already. We started off, we were talking about just walking through the video store aisles, and we're all at least close enough to a generation where that was a very strong part of our youth. But looking for those, and I love the way you put this, Frazer, about like actually looking for those problem solvers, that pirate-like ethos, understanding that these things were being made with, Chris, as you put it, that punk rock DIY, like intellectual reality of, and maybe that's not the reason you watched the first one, but as adults looking back in time, that pirate ethos it's kind of really attractive in the world today, I think. At least that's the way I feel about it. Do you guys feel the same?
From my perspective, in a world where authenticity is in such short supply and manufactured, and AI's out there and CGI creates this and that and whatever, when you see, how did they get that arrow to go through his neck like that? How did they create this thing where, the alien comes through the chest and, that jump cut or this or the scare. I just really like watching that problem solving in some ways. And so I get two bites at the apple. I get to try to enjoy it as a story and whatever is achieved, through the actual technical execution of the horror movie. And then I get to go back and sort of deconstruct and sort of take what I think is a learned opinion on these things and say, oh, what might have I done? Or how did he do that? Or how did she do that? Or man, this performance was really good in a sea of mediocrity. And you start finding joy in little things on that stuff. That to me is where I come out on it.
What about you, CT? I feel like it's a version of the same thing for you.
Yeah, it's actually really funny. You bring up wanting to see how things are done. It's almost like wanting to see how the magician accomplishes the trick. This morning before this, I was like, I'm going to throw on Evil Dead, the reboot, because I hadn't watched it. I thought it would be appropriate to watch before this. And I did notice there's a scene where she cuts her arm off, and I saw how they did it. Like there's a frame or two where you could just see a little more than you were supposed to see, and they did the effect practically, and that's why it looks so good. But now I know how they did it, and it's even cooler. I'm like, oh, that was clever, man, because it looks grotesque. Like the whole scene as it plays out, because the camera doesn't really cut away, and that's what makes it so good. It looks like it's her arms. Like, how do they do that? And they did it practically. And just having that confirmation, those couple frames of confirmation, it actually makes the movie better to me. And I don't know, maybe that's just a product of loving movies in the 80s where they are, you know what the effects are. You can see the difference in skin tone when they've got the prosthetic on, especially now that everything's been upscaled to 4K. There's things we can see now that they didn't really anticipate showing up on home viewing. So, I can appreciate that. I think that's absolutely a fun part of it. And really that's when you start getting deeper into the genre. If you're looking to get into the genre, there are so many things to appreciate beyond just, well, this is the story and this is how it progresses. It's all the different things that go into it of how did they actually accomplish this task? Where did all that blood come from, right? How did they get that many gallons of blood to come out of that wall in Evil Dead 2? Like, how did that happen? It's just fun from an entirely different and kind of morbid, I guess, perspective.
Just to follow on top of that, a shout out to the makeup artists and the visual effects people. But the makeup artists, that really is a weird form of art, watching what they put together and how that happens, because you see what's on screen. It took 6 hours to make it happen. You only get 1 or 2 takes at it, because to redo all that stuff takes 3 hours to clean it up, and you got to reset it and do all this stuff. It's just amazing. It's really amazing. And so the high wire act that's involved in getting that executed and then having it work on screen, there's all sorts of stories like, they did this amazing thing and they forgot to have film in the camera, or the boom dropped, or the lights went out, or something like that. And you're going, oh my gosh, it's a crazy one. But the makeup and practical effects part, I hate to say that like the CGI, because that's art too, and it takes dozens and dozens and dozens of people to put together oftentimes, especially in the big productions. But there's something real and tangible about that the practical effects that gets back to that punk rock ethos, that gets back to that do-it-yourself component that I think it brings like a tactile feature or a granularity that doesn't exist as much in that sort of CGI world.
Did you guys?
Yeah, when you're
doing,
sorry, I was gonna say when you're doing CGI effects, it's almost like you're working with a net, right? When you're doing practical effects, it's no net. You fall, you're going right on your face. So there's something to be appreciated about that for sure.
Did you guys watch the Evil Dead Stars or whatever outfit did it? That reboot TV series they did.
I haven't.
There was a TV series.
Few years ago, but probably my favorite part and the thing that I'd actually consider a rewatch for is, and you'd probably have to jump the algorithm because it's going to try to autoplay the next episode or something. They had, because it's all practical effects through the whole thing. And they did like a 15-minute deep dive at the end of every 45-ish minute like episode or however long they were. I think they were 45-ish minute, maybe an hour.
Talking about Ash vs. Evil Dead or?
Thank you. That's the name of it.
Okay. Yeah.
You watched that.
I've seen that too. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. In the Ash versus Evil Dead series, those little segments at the end where they actually broke that down, possibly as cool as if not better than the entire series.
I remember watching the at least one of those, and they broke down the first episode with the deer head and all the effects in that room. I don't know if I saw the other ones.
They did it for every single episode.
Practical effects, yeah.
Yeah, watching it live, they were putting it on after every single one. I was like, that's the biggest appointment of this thing. Like, I couldn't watch it unless I could see the 15-minute after effect. And what I think is really cool about something like that, too, and thank you for correcting me getting the name wrong on this, because it's this is kind of that attractor filter idea. That's an idea where you like have established IP, we've taken it, we've proven it in this thing. And then I really got the sense like a project like that draws a whole bunch of new people in, or people who just wanted to try their hand at an old thing. That's really cool that capital can be raised around a concept like that. That's a really neat thing to think about how the ecosystem plays out over time. We talked about tropes and genre expectations, creating what the audience feels and how much, and Chris, I love the way you put this. You talked about it as a learned language. So it's not something you just like snap into, which I think is important too. That means people can't just, you can dive in and experience something the first time one way. Right. But what you guys are both exhibiting here is you will start to exhibit it in more ways the more you stick with learning this language over time.
I was going to say there's a reward to putting in work to understand something. And then it's like an onion. You just peel back the layers and discover more and more things with, finding art and schlock. Sometimes that's its own reward.
Yeah. And even getting through a movie that really disturbs you, that can feel like an accomplishment at the end, right? You feel like you really made it through something, or, a movie that makes you go through uncomfortable scenes in order to get to the end. It makes the payoff feel like it's more worthwhile. So it works on the large, macro scale, but even when you just focus down on one movie, like, all right, this one's going to be tough. I know it's going to scare the hell out of me, but I'm going to watch it anyway. Like I still haven't watched Fall. Probably not a scary movie for most people, but it's just these two girls that get stuck at the top of a radio tower. If I watch those videos on like YouTube and somebody's high up, my hands start sweating. So like, I know I have to watch that movie. I have to make myself do it. But for me, I'm going to have sweaty palms throughout the entire movie. So I can't wait to get to the end of it.
Yeah, and for me, The Descent is like that, because being in an enclosed space, that doesn't work with me one iota. And I got through it, and that movie had a really good payoff for me because that was not the only component of the horror. There's other stuff going on too, and then you really go back into it, and they had two different endings. And there's that one, that's one that deserves a look for the different people who do podcasts around that, because I think that's a really, really strong example of the space. So CT, if I'm putting in a request, I don't know if you've done it yet on your show, but that's one that I'm gonna ask for.
I have not. Yeah, that one is interesting as well. You mentioned the two different endings and how divisive those two endings are.
Right.
So yeah, that's probably worth talking about just for that alone. Because it's a great movie. Whatever ending you get, I still think it's a great movie. The journey's fantastic. Yeah, I'm not super into being underground in tiny spaces either. That's not, no.
Yeah.
So yeah, it works from that perspective as well. Like, yeah, it's a bit of a monster movie, but there's a number of different horrors going on. Even just the interpersonal relationships between the characters. That's why that movie's so great. It works on at least 2 or 3 different levels of
no
horrifying.
We talked about favorite franchises, not just for money. Frazer, I think I have you on record for Psycho. I think CT, I have you on record now for The Dead and the things, at least up to, what did you say, Land of the Dead is where you'd start to draw the line.
Yeah, right around there. I gotta parachute out.
All right, so now let's end on this from each of you. What's a good, or what do you think is, and whether it's from Psycho or the Dead series or something else, what's a good entry point one, and then what's a good one where almost like you'd recommend Lord of the Rings to somebody and be like, just give this a shot. Just try this Lonesome Dove or try this Star Wars thing on for size. Give me a good entry point thing, and then give me a good like franchise recommendation. CT, go first.
Well, yeah, I'm going to, this kind of a weird recommendation, but because it's so weird, start with Texas Chainsaw, because it kind of shows you how differently you can do the same concept, right? Because you've got the original, which is just, it's kind of untouchable. I don't think anything's going to be scary the way that is, just because it feels like a snuff film. And then you've got the sequel, which is it's like a dark comedy. And then in the 90s, you've got the McConaughey Massacre. Then you've got I think it's 03 was the reboot with Jessica Biel, which again tries to make it dirty and grimy and kind of launched that whole Platinum Dunes reboot look, which, sort of continued up through the Friday the 13th reboot. But there was off of that reboot, I know they made a prequel and I think maybe another sequel. And then there's the 2022 Texas Chainsaw, which it kind of does the Halloween thing. It tries to be a sequel to the original. It doesn't actually make, I don't think, much logical sense, but as far as connecting to the original, but it's one of those, who cares? It's a guy with a chainsaw and here's all the gore.
I really liked that one. I thought, and they do a couple funny things. One of them where they make fun of, sort of TikTok culture, which I loved. There was some cultural payback for this old guy here, where I was like, I love how they attacked that.
It felt like everyone was purposefully a bit of a caricature in that movie. Like it wasn't subtle about it at all. But I think that's what's fun about that franchise is, from entry 2 was such a departure from the first one. It's now like, all right, we got a guy in Texas. He's got someone else's face on his face. He's got a chainsaw. That's basically it. From there, do what you want. So it's kind of what's fun about that franchise. It doesn't have the pressures of Halloween or Friday the 13th, I feel like, where people are much more opinionated on those for some reason. And maybe it's, again, just because there's been so many kind of mediocre to bad Texas Chainsaws, but they're all kind of weirdly fun in their own way. There was another one too with the girl that was on the HBO show. She was like his cousin. I think it was just called Texas Chainsaw.
Right. Is that the do your thing, cuz one?
That's exactly what was going on. Do your thing, cuz, and throws him the chainsaw. Like Texas Chainsaw 2022 is that scene, but a whole movie.
Frazer, what about you? Give me like a good entry point for somebody who's like, I don't speak the language, but I'm gonna go visit Italy and sample my way through, and then give me something a little broader.
So I mean, I think you get a real taste of it. I think Halloween 1 and 2, 78 and 81, that's a good sample of top of the field in the first one, and then what top of the field onto the, either a level of abstraction removed from that, or what the next extension is. I think that's a good entry point, because you get to see sort of the mastercraft, and then let's call it a slasher example, and then the stuff we were talking about, sort of the challenges and the subtleties of what was trying to be achieved on top of a massive success. You can see a good example of that achieved pretty well in the second one. And, it's only 2 movies. You're not trying to wade through the rest of it, which, that requires some real blunt force trauma to get through. I think, and then as just to sort of, the Friday the 13th ones, which it's strange because they always sort of take the first chunk of the movie to revisit what happened before. So you can kind of get bored with that. But the first 4, the first one is great because it's the twist is genre defining in many ways. The second one is an interesting sort of approach to taking it to the next level. The third one is sort of the extension and kind of the first sort of Jason in its modern form. And then the fourth is really where it, in my opinion, it ends correctly. And then that's a good sampler and a good sort of arc to seeing brilliant. I don't know if Friday the 13th I'd call it brilliant, but the twist is really good. The second one I really like. The third one, you can kind of see an example of a traditional slasher and what that means. And then the fourth one is trying to wind it up and doing that in a good way. And they've all got silliness and weirdness to all of them that sort of take away from perfection in a lot of ways. But if you're going for usual suspects, those are good ones.
I think they're good to watch too, just in the perspective of treating our visual effects people like real artists. Because you had Savini on 1 and 4, but he wasn't there on 2 and 3, and they really had to shoot around a lot of things. I mean, they're still great, but there's absolutely a difference when you see one and you see, like, in one, you get to see the arrow come right through the neck. You get to see the full thing, versus 2 and 3, it's going to cut away real quick, or it's maybe just going to show you the arrow going through the other side of the bed rather than right through the torso. Again, still wildly entertaining, but it shows you what you miss or what you get when you have somebody that's really at top of their game when it comes to those visual effects.
I got to say, there's nothing like just being a fan of freaks, being a fan of people who are so obsessed with stuff and will go so down. And I say that with complete love. It's a complete sign of affection and endearment for the two of you, because it's okay to be into some kind of weird stuff, but just realize like how much breadth is there and how much actually applies to the beginning. I can't wait to replay this conversation and go back and hearing Frazer relate this to marketing in the wealth management industry, because I think it's so friggin' true.
It's not that far off.
It's not that far off, and it's worth exploring, because that means whether this is the thing you're into or you're into, I don't know, someday I'll find the 2 people who want to do romantic comedies for this topic, for this podcast. Yeah, we'll do a big crossover episode. But you can learn from this stuff. It's all just wax on, wax off, all the way down. I'm convinced. CT Reese, one more time, tell the people where they can find you.
Now, you can find me on YouTube, Watch with CT. I'm on Instagram now as well, sort of. Well, I just started on Instagram, so don't be shocked by how few followers I have, but I'm Watch with CT on Instagram as well. But really, it's all about the YouTube. You're going to find at least weekly. I usually try to post a couple times a week, though, reviews on horror, sci-fi, and genre movies that I'm just digging right now, or in some cases, not digging at all. But I always have a good time making the videos, so.
Awesome. Frazer, same thing.
Frazer Rice, Wealth Actually. If you Google it, there's a book and a podcast, and I'm on Twitter and Instagram and all those different things.
Fantastic. This is Just Press Record, the Cultish Creative YouTube channel. I'm Matt Ziegler. Like, subscribe, all the things, and we are out. Thanks for joining us. Like, comment, and hey, subscribe below. The Cultish Creative on YouTube if you haven't already. As the good compliance people want me to remind you, Matt Ziegler, that's me, is a managing director at Sunpoint Investments. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Sunpoint Investments. No information on this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of clients of Sunpoint Investments. I hope you've been entertained. I hope you found this useful. I hope you talk to a professional before you try any of this stuff at home. And most of all, I hope you've subscribed. Be nice to each other out there. And don't forget, head over to cultishcreative.com and let's make curiosity a habit together. And I'm out.